Let me set the scene for you. I am sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building I have never been to before. There are 8 people around the table, a client team that could change the entire direction of my company. My CEO is at the head of the room, and my manager David is standing at the front, slowly falling apart. He doesn't know I'm watching from the hallway. He doesn't know the CEO has just stepped out of that room and is walking toward me right now with his phone already raised. He doesn't know that in about 4 minutes, I'm going to walk into that room and answer every single question that has left him speechless for the last 20 minutes. And he definitely doesn't know that the project he presented to senior leadership as his own work is the exact project those clients are asking about. I built it, every line of it, every late night, every version, every decision. I built it. And for months, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I was waiting quietly, patiently, for the work to speak for itself. This is the story of how it did. I have never been the loudest person in any room. That's not modesty. It's just accurate. I don't network aggressively. I don't talk over people in meetings. I don't volunteer for visibility the way some people do, the ones who seem to spend more energy being seen doing work than actually doing it. What I do is deliver, quietly, consistently, on time. I had been at the company for about 3 years when this story really begins. Mid-sized firm, the kind of place that feels stable on the surface, decent clients, decent revenue, a leadership team that had been there long enough to feel permanent. You knew who sat where. You knew who ordered what at the team lunches. You knew which meetings actually mattered and which ones existed just to make someone feel important. I had found my footing there. It took about a year. It always takes about a year somewhere new. But by the time I hit year 2, I knew my value. I knew what I was good at. And more importantly, I knew how to get things done inside that particular machine. I kept my head down. I hit my targets. I built a reputation, not a loud one, not a flashy one, but a real one. The kind where people come to you when something actually needs to get done. Not when they need someone to talk about getting it done. When they need it done. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. My manager's name was David. David was, and I'll be fair here, genuinely good at parts of his job. The parts that involve other people. Meetings, presentations, managing upward. He was smooth in a way that looked completely effortless. He could walk into a room where the energy was tense and uncomfortable and leave it feeling like everything was under control. He had a way of speaking that made whatever he said sound considered, measured, authoritative. Senior leadership liked him. That was clear from early on. He was always in the right meetings, always had the right read on what the people above him wanted to hear. He dressed well. He followed up on things promptly. He remembered names and used them. He had that quality some people have, where they just seem credible. Before they said anything of substance, before they've proven anything, they just seem like the type of person who knows what they're doing. And for a long time, I had no reason to question that. My first year under David was genuinely fine. He gave me space to work, which I appreciated more than almost anything. He didn't hover. He didn't second-guess every decision I made. He checked in, passed feedback along from above, and mostly let me do what I was hired to do. I respected that. Some managers can't do it. They need to feel their hands on everything. David wasn't like that, at least not in the way I could see at the time. But I started noticing small things. The way he would take my updates from our one-on-ones and repackage them almost word for word in team meetings, presenting them as his own read on a situation, his own conclusions. The way credit would drift toward him naturally without anyone specifically directing it there. Nobody was making a conscious choice. It just happened. And David never did anything to stop it. He never lied outright. That was the thing. There was no single moment I could point to and say, there, that's the lie. It was more like a series of omissions, a pattern of letting the right assumptions form in the right people's minds, and staying quiet while they did. I noticed, but I told myself it was normal. Most managers absorb some credit for their team's work. That's how organizations function. I wasn't there for recognition. I was there to build things and be compensated fairly for it. So I kept my head down, and I kept going. Around the middle of year 2, David gave me what I can only describe as the most significant project of my time at that company. It wasn't handed to me with any ceremony. He just dropped it in my lap one afternoon, casual, almost offhand, and said the company had a problem that had been quietly causing friction with clients for longer than anyone wanted to admit. An internal process, outdated, clunky, the kind of thing that looked fine from the inside, but was embarrassing the moment a client looked closely at it. He wanted a full rebuild, a working system, properly documented, scalable enough to grow with the business. He said he was counting on me. Then he walked back to his desk and went back to his calendar. I spent the next 4 months building it from the ground up. I am not going to walk through the technical details. That's not the point of this story. But I want you to understand what 4 months of real work actually feels like. The early mornings before anyone else arrived. The late evenings when the office had gone quiet and you're still there running through a problem that won't let you leave. The weekends where you told yourself you'd only check one thing and then looked up 2 hours later. Nobody asked me to do that. There was no overtime, no bonus tied to the hours. I did it because I could see what this thing could become, and I wanted to build it properly. I was making decisions nobody had told me how to make, solving problems that hadn't been anticipated when the project was handed to me, documenting everything so thoroughly that someone who had never seen it before could pick it up and understand exactly what had been built and why. When it was finished, I felt that specific kind of satisfaction you only get from building something real, something that works, something you made from nothing. I was proud of it. I handed it to David on a Thursday afternoon. He looked it over, spent maybe 10 minutes clicking through it, said it looked great, said he would take it to the senior leadership presentation the following week. I assumed I would be in that room. I assumed I would be introduced. I assumed that when he said he would take it to the presentation, he meant we would. I was not invited, and I found out afterward through a colleague who had been there that David stood at the front of that room and walked senior leadership through the entire project, confidently, fluently, in detail, as if he had built it himself. My name was not mentioned once. I want to tell you that I walked into David's office the next morning and confronted him directly. But that's not what happened. What happened is, I sat with it, quietly, for a long time. I heard about the presentation on a Friday afternoon. A colleague, someone I trusted, someone who had been in that room, pulled me aside after a team meeting and said almost carefully that David had presented the project. That had gone well. That leadership was impressed. He paused before he said the next part. He said my name didn't come up. I thanked him for telling me. I walked back to my desk. I sat down, and I stared at my screen for a while without really seeing it. I want to describe what that feeling is like because it's not quite anger. Not right away. It's something quieter than that. Something closer to disbelief. The specific disorientation of realizing that something you knew to be true has been rewritten, and everyone in that room accepted the new version without question. For months of work, every early morning, every late night, every decision I had made alone in a quiet office, presented as someone else's. And nobody pushed back. Nobody asked questions. Because David was convincing, and I wasn't in the room, and that's all it took. I went home that weekend, and I thought carefully about what to do. The obvious move, the emotional move, would have been to say something. To go to David directly. To walk into HR. To send an email to someone above him and lay out exactly what had happened. I thought about all of those options. And then I thought about how each one would likely play out. David was smooth. David was well-liked upstairs. David had been there longer than me and had relationships I didn't have. If I walked in and said he had taken credit for my work, it would be my word against his. And in that particular equation, I already knew which way the scales were tilted. I had no proof. I had the work itself, but David had already stood in a room and claimed it. That version of events had already been received and accepted by the people who mattered. So I made a different decision. I decided to say nothing. Not forever, not out of fear, but strategically, deliberately. Because if I was going to say anything, if I was ever going to prove what had actually happened, I needed more than a feeling. I needed a record. That Monday, I started documenting everything. Quietly, methodically, without telling anyone. I went back through my files and organized everything related to the project. The original drafts, the early versions with timestamps, the development notes I had been keeping as I built it, the email threads where David had passed instructions to me, instructions that proved he had handed the project off entirely, that the thinking and the building had been mine. I saved everything, multiple backups, personal storage he had no access to, and then I kept working, normally, as if nothing had happened. That part was harder than the documentation. Sitting in meetings with David, listening to him speak about the project in the present tense, as if he were still managing it, still guiding it, using language that suggested an intimacy with the work he simply did not have. Watching people respond to him with the kind of respect that should have been shared, at minimum, if not directed somewhere else entirely. I said nothing. I kept my face neutral. I took my notes. Weeks passed, and something shifted, and not in a way I had expected. David's confidence grew. That's the thing about getting away with something. It doesn't make cautious people out of most people. It makes them bolder. David had stood in a room, claimed work that wasn't his, received genuine praise for it from senior leadership, and nothing had happened. No pushback, no questions, no consequences. So he kept going. I started noticing it more clearly now that I was watching for it. Little things at first. He would reference the project in conversations with leadership, casually, fluently, dropping in details that I recognized from my own documentation, using my logic, my framing, my solutions, presenting them as instincts he had developed, decisions he had made. And because he had been so thorough in claiming the original work, nobody had any reason to question his fluency with it. He had built a version of himself in other people's minds that didn't match reality. And that version was now load-bearing. His reputation depended on it. His relationships with leadership depended on it. He just didn't know yet how fragile that kind of structure really is. I kept documenting. I kept working. I kept delivering because that was the one thing I could control completely. The quality of my output. The consistency of my results. And I waited, not with anger, not with a plan fully formed, just with patience, because I had learned something important in those weeks of sitting quietly with what David had done. Work leaves a trail. Real work, the kind where decisions get made and problems get solved and things actually get built. It leaves a trail that doesn't disappear just because someone else stands up and takes the bow. The files existed. The timestamps existed, the emails existed, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I understood that the truth doesn't need you to fight for it constantly. Sometimes you just need to keep it somewhere safe and wait for the moment it becomes relevant. That moment was coming. I didn't know exactly when. I didn't know exactly how. But I knew David had built something on a foundation that wasn't his. And foundations like that eventually get tested. 3 months after the presentation, the company landed the opportunity. I heard about it the way most people at my level heard about things, through the edges. A comment in a hallway. A shift in the energy of leadership meetings. The kind of low hum that moves through an office when something significant is happening but hasn't been announced yet. Then it was announced. A major new client. The kind of name that changes how a company talks about itself. The kind of contract that gets referenced in every all-hands meeting for the next 2 years. Leadership was treating it like a turning point, and honestly, from what I understood about the numbers, they weren't wrong. The pitch was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and David volunteered to lead it. I was not surprised. Of course he volunteered. This was exactly the kind of moment David was built for. High visibility, high stakes, all eyes in the front of the room. He thrived in those settings. And after the success of the senior leadership presentation, his stock inside the company had never been higher. What I noticed and filed away quietly was how he talked about the pitch in the weeks leading up to it. Confidently, almost casually, as if the outcome were already settled. He referenced the project often. Our capabilities, he would say, our approach, our methodology, using language that implied deep ownership, deep familiarity, the kind that only comes from having actually built something. Except he hadn't built it, and I watched him speak about it. And I thought about the questions a serious client would ask. Not surface questions, not the kind you can answer with a polished slide and good posture. The real questions, the ones that go underneath the presentation and test whether the person in front of you actually understands what they're selling. I thought about those questions, and I thought about David trying to answer them. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not anticipation, something closer to dread, if I'm being truthful. Because whatever happened in that room, whatever the outcome, I was connected to it. That project was mine. If the pitch failed because David couldn't defend work he didn't understand, the work itself would be tainted. The thing I had built and was proud of would be associated with a failure. That bothered me more than anything David had done personally. So I did what I always do. I focused on what I could control. In the weeks before the pitch, I quietly made sure my documentation was current. Not because I planned to use it. I still had no clear plan. Just because keeping records had become habit by then. A discipline. Something I did regardless of whether it ever mattered. I was not invited to the pitch preparation meetings. David ran those himself, with a small group he had handpicked. I wasn't on that list, which made sense from his perspective. Why invite the person whose work you've claimed into the room where you're preparing to claim it again? I heard secondhand that the prep sessions had gone well. That David was sharp. That leadership was confident going in. The pitch was on a Tuesday. I was in the office that morning, sitting at my desk, working on something unrelated. The pitch team had left early, suits, printed decks, the quiet energy of people about to do something important. I watched them leave and went back to my work. For the first 2 hours, I heard nothing. Then, around mid-morning, I noticed something. A few people near the leadership corridor were moving differently. Quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that isn't calm. It's the quiet of people who don't know what to say. I didn't ask anyone what was happening. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was the CEO. His name was Richard. I had spoken to him maybe 4 or 5 times in 3 years. Brief exchanges, the kind you have with someone 2 levels above you in a mid-sized company. He knew my name. He knew my work in a broad sense. But we did not have the kind of relationship where he called me directly. I stared at the phone for 1 full ring. Then I answered. He didn't waste time. His voice was calm, but tight. The voice of someone managing a situation in real time. He told me where they were. He told me the client had questions the team wasn't able to answer fully. He told me the questions were about the project. Then he asked me if I could come down. Not a request exactly, but not an order either. Something in between, the kind of ask that contains within it the full weight of what's at stake. I said yes. I told him I'd be there in 15 minutes. I closed my laptop. I picked up the bag I always kept packed out habit. I took the elevator down to the lobby and got into a car. And in those 15 minutes, I felt something settle inside me. Not nerves, not excitement, something quieter than both. I had spent months watching someone else stand in front of rooms and speak about work I had done. Months of silence, months of documentation, months of patience. And now the work itself, the actual substance of what I had built, was sitting in a room asking questions that only one person could answer. I hadn't planned this. I hadn't arranged it. I hadn't wished for it exactly. It had just arrived. The car pulled up to the building. I looked up at the glass front of it. Somewhere on one of those floors, David was standing at a whiteboard, running out of answers. I picked up my bag and walked inside. The receptionist on the 14th floor was expecting me. She didn't say much, just nodded, asked me to follow her, and walked me down a corridor toward a set of double doors I could already hear quiet voices behind. She stopped just short of them. She said Richard would be out in a moment. I stood there, straightened my jacket, took a breath. The doors opened and Richard stepped out. He was composed, the way experienced leaders are composed when things are going wrong. Controlled surface, tight eyes, He shook my hand and moved us a few steps away from the doors. He gave me the picture in about 60 seconds. The client team was sharp, technical. They had come in with real questions, not the kind you field with confidence in a good slide, but the kind that required genuine understanding of how something was built and why specific decisions were made. David had handled the opening well, the broad strokes, the narrative, but as the questions got more specific, the gaps had started showing. Not dramatically at first, just small hesitations, answers that were slightly off, explanations that circled without landing. The client had noticed. One of them, Richard described him as a senior technical lead, had started pushing harder, asking follow-up questions that built on the previous answers. The kind of questioning that is perfectly polite on the surface, but is actually a test. And the more David answered, the clearer it became that something wasn't adding up. Richard said the room had gotten uncomfortable about 40 minutes in. He said the client had paused the presentation. He said one of them had used a phrase, not quite what we were expecting. Richard looked at me when he said that. Steady, measuring. Then he said, I need you to go in there and answer their questions. Honestly, completely. Whatever they ask. I nodded. He held the door open. I walked in. The room was a long conference table with windows on one side. 8 people from the client side. 3 from ours, David, and 2 others from the pitch team. A presentation still pulled up on the screen behind where David was standing. David saw me come in. I will not spend long on his expression because this isn't about his expression, but I saw it. A flash of something. Confusion, alarm, the beginning of an objection that he decided in real time not to voice. Richard introduced me simply. Said I was the person who had built the system they were discussing. Said I was here to answer any outstanding questions directly. The client team shifted. I felt the energy in the room change. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The kind of shift that happens when something that was stuck suddenly has room to move. The senior technical lead looked at me. He said, we've been trying to understand the decision behind a specific part of the architecture. He described it precisely, technically, using the exact language of someone who genuinely understood what they were looking at. I knew the answer before he finished the question, because I had made that decision. At 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, 3 months earlier, sitting alone in a quiet office, working through a problem nobody had told me how to solve. I answered him, directly, specifically. I explained the decision, the reasoning behind it, the alternatives I had considered, and why I had ruled them out. I explained what the approach allowed the system to do that the alternatives wouldn't have. He nodded slowly while I was talking. Then he asked a follow-up. Then another. I answered everyone. I could feel the room changing as we went. The client team leaning in slightly rather than back. The tension that had been sitting in the air for the last hour beginning to loosen. Questions becoming less pointed and more genuinely curious. The difference between testing someone and actually wanting to understand something. We went for another 40 minutes. At some point, I became aware that David had sat down, that he was no longer standing, that the front of the room, without anyone deciding it explicitly, had shifted. I didn't acknowledge it. I stayed focused on the client, on their questions, on making sure every answer was clear and complete and honest. When the last question landed and I finished answering it, there was a pause. The senior technical lead looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them. Not words, just a look. The kind that means a decision has been made. He looked back at me and said, "This is exactly what we needed to understand." They asked for 30 minutes to confer privately. Our team stepped out into the corridor. Richard stood next to me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "How long have you been working on this?" I told him, "For months of building, several more of maintaining it quietly since." He nodded, said nothing else. We waited. 28 minutes later, the doors opened. The senior technical lead came out and shook Richard's hand. Then he turned to me and shook mine. He said they were moving forward. He said they were looking forward to working with the team. Richard thanked him. Arrangements were made for the paperwork to follow. The client team gathered their things with the easy, unhurried energy of people who had gotten what they came for. And I stood in that corridor and felt something very simple. Not triumph, not vindication, just the clean, quiet satisfaction of work that had been tested and had held. The deal was signed. The room had shifted, and everyone still standing in that corridor now knew, without anyone having said a single word about it, exactly who had built what. The client team left at around 2 in the afternoon. Handshakes, business cards, the warm, unhurried goodbye of people who had just made a decision they felt good about. The senior technical lead paused at the elevator and looked back at me once, gave a small nod. The kind that doesn't need words. Then they were gone. The corridor emptied quickly after that. The pitch team dispersed. People had calls to make, emails to send, the administrative machinery of a signed deal to set in motion. David left without saying anything to me. I watched him go. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, stared at the doors. His back was straight. His posture was composed. He was performing composure. I could see the difference by then. The elevator came. He stepped in. The doors closed. I didn't feel anything particular watching that. Just noted it. Filed it away. Richard appeared on my shoulder about 5 minutes later. He said, "Do you have a few minutes?" It wasn't really a question. We went to a smaller room off the main corridor. Just the two of us. He closed the door, and we sat down across from each other at a small table. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means someone is choosing their words carefully. Then he asked, "How long has this been going on?" I had thought about this moment. Not obsessively, not in a scheming way, but in the practical way you think about something when you know, somewhere in the back of your mind, that it might eventually arrive. I didn't answer immediately. I reached into my bag and I took out my laptop. I opened it. I turned it to face him. I had the folder ready. I had kept it organized for exactly this kind of moment. Not because I had planned to use it on any specific day, but because I believe in keeping things orderly, in having your record straight, in being able to show your work. I walked him through it calmly. The original project files, dated, time-stamped, created and modified by my account across those 4 months. The development notes I had kept throughout, decisions recorded in real time, problems logged and solved in my own words. The email chain where David had handed the project to me. His exact words. His explicit instruction to build it from scratch. My responses. My updates. His brief replies that made clear he was receiving my progress reports, not contributing to them. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add commentary. I just showed him the record. Richard sat across from me and read carefully. He scrolled slowly. He went back to certain emails more than once. He looked at the timestamps. He didn't rush. When he reached the end, he sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. A long moment. Then he closed the laptop gently and slid it back across the table toward me. He said, "I appreciate you showing me this." That was all he said. We sat there for another few seconds in silence. Then he stood, shook my hand, and told me he would be in touch. I packed my laptop away. I thanked him for calling me in. I meant it, not sarcastically, not with any edge. I was grateful the work had gotten a fair hearing. That was all I had ever wanted. I took the elevator back down alone. On the ride back to the office, I thought about the months I'd spent sitting quietly at my desk, watching David speak in meetings, watching credit drift in the wrong direction, saying nothing, keeping my records, doing my work. I had never been certain any of it would matter. That's the thing people don't tell you about patience. It isn't comfortable. It doesn't come with any guarantee. You keep your records, and you do your work, and you wait. And there is always the very real possibility that the moment never comes, that the wrong version of events just becomes the accepted one, and you move on having never corrected it. I had made peace with that possibility, which is maybe why, when the moment did come, I felt so little urgency about it. No rush to make sure everyone understood what had happened. No need to explain myself beyond what was asked. The record spoke. I let it. Back at the office, the rest of the afternoon passed normally, or almost normally. I noticed people looking at me slightly differently. Not dramatically, just a small shift in how eyes landed. The way someone who has just been recalibrated looks at a thing they thought they understood. I sat at my desk and finished the work I had been doing that morning. I stayed my usual time, packed up, said goodnight to the people I always said goodnight to. I drove home, made dinner, went to bed, and for the first time in several months, I slept without anything unresolved sitting at the back of my mind. The documentation was no longer something I was holding in reserve. It had been seen by the right person at the right moment. Whatever happened next was no longer in my hands. And that felt exactly right. 3 weeks passed before anything changed visibly. That surprised me at first. I had expected something immediate, some obvious shift, some announcement, some visible consequence. But that's not how things move inside organizations, especially at the management level, especially when the people involved are well-liked and the situation is complicated and the company has just signed its biggest deal of the year. Things move quietly, carefully, through channels you can't always see. I kept working. Same desk, same hours, same output. David kept working too. He was in his usual meetings, responded to emails, conducted himself professionally, on the surface at least. But something had changed in the texture of things. The way senior leadership spoke to him in group settings. The meetings he was no longer copied on. The small, almost imperceptible way that rooms reorganized themselves when he walked in. Nobody said anything out loud. Nobody needed to. Then one morning Richard's assistant called and asked if I had time to meet that afternoon. I said yes. We met in his office this time, not the small side room. His actual office, with the city behind him through the window. He offered me coffee. I took it. He said the company wanted to recognize my contribution to the project, to the pitch, to the relationship with a new client, which had continued positively in the weeks since signing. He said leadership had been doing some internal restructuring and that they wanted to offer me a senior position. A real one. New title. Significant salary increase. A seat at the table on the accounts that mattered most. He said they valued me, that they should have done a better job of demonstrating that sooner. I thanked him. I meant it. I asked for a few days to consider the offer. He said, of course. We shook hands. I left. What I didn't tell him, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that 2 days earlier I had received a message through a professional network from a recruiter named Claire. She was direct in her message, said she represented a larger firm, a competitor in the honest sense of the word, said she had heard about what happened at the pitch, not from me, not from anyone at my company, but from someone on the client side who had been in that room, someone who had watched the presentation fall apart and then watched it come back together, someone who had apparently mentioned, in conversation afterward, that the person who saved the deal was not the person who had been running it. Word travels, especially through clients, especially when what they witnessed was that clear. Claire said her firm was looking for someone with exactly my profile. She named a title. She named a number. The number was significantly better than what Richard had just offered me. I sat with both options for 3 days. I thought about loyalty, about history, about the relationships I had built at the company over 3 years, about the new deal which I had helped land and which I genuinely wanted to see succeed. I thought about what it would mean to stay, to accept the promotion, to sit in better meetings and be paid more fairly and continue doing good work inside a structure that had, for a significant period of time, allowed someone to build a career on top of mine. And I thought about what it would mean to leave, to take my work ethic and my track record and my knowledge somewhere that had sought me out specifically, somewhere that had heard about what I could do from someone I had never spoken to and decided, before even meeting me, that they wanted that. On the 3rd day, I called Claire back. I accepted her offer. I resigned from my position the following Monday morning. Professionally, cleanly, I gave full notice. I wrote a resignation letter that was warm and genuine, because my issues had never been with the company itself. I thanked Richard personally. I tied off every open thread I could find. I documented my handover thoroughly. I did not make a scene. I did not explain my reasons beyond the standard language of a new opportunity. I did not say a single word about David. There was nothing left to say about David. He had already been quietly moved, restructured out of his management position into an individual contributor role. No announcement, no explanation given publicly, just a change in reporting lines that anyone paying attention could read clearly. He was still there, still employed, but the platform was gone. The visibility was gone. The ability to stand at the front of rooms and receive credit for things he hadn't built, that was gone. I heard about it through the same colleague who had told me about the original presentation. He mentioned it briefly, almost carefully, watching my face for a reaction. I nodded, said something neutral, changed the subject. I didn't need to dwell on it. It wasn't mine to dwell on. My last day at the company was a Friday. People stopped by my desk throughout the day. Small conversations. Genuine ones, mostly. A few people said they were sorry to see me go. A few said they hoped we'd stay in touch. I meant it when I said I hoped so too. I packed my things into a single bag. It didn't take long, and I walked out into the early evening. I started a new role the following month. The work was better. The autonomy was real. The title reflected what I actually did. The salary reflected what I was actually worth. I kept my head down. I delivered. I kept my records. Same habits. Same discipline. Same approach that had served me well before. And then, a few months into the new role, something happened that I hadn't anticipated, that I hadn't arranged, that I want to be very clear I had nothing to do with. 3 of the clients I had worked most closely with at the old company reached out to my new firm directly. Not because I had called them, not because I had suggested it, not because I had said a single word to any of them about making a move. They reached out because they had relationships with me, real ones built over time through consistent work and honest communication. And when I was no longer at the place they associated those relationships with, they followed the relationship, not the address. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked. Relationships follow competence, not job titles, not office addresses, not whoever is standing at the front of the room on any given Tuesday. The people who do the work, the people who answer the hard questions, the people who are there when things go wrong and know how to make them right. Those are the people clients remember. I don't know exactly what things looked like at the old company after that. I heard things occasionally, the way you hear things through industry channels and mutual contacts, that the new client relationship had required more support than expected, that a few other accounts had gone quieter, that David's reduced role had been reduced further still. I didn't seek that information out, and I didn't take any particular feeling from it when it arrived. I was busy. I had good work in front of me. I had a team that knew what I had done and a title that said it clearly and a salary that confirmed it. I had moved on, not in the way people say it when they haven't, not as a performance of being unbothered. I actually moved on, because here's the thing I understood by the end of all of it, the thing that maybe sounds simple but took a long time to really settle in me. I never needed David to be exposed. I never needed a moment of public vindication. I never needed anyone to stand up in a room and announce what had actually happened. I just needed to keep doing the work. The work was always going to tell the truth eventually, on its own timeline, in its own way. And it did. That's enough. That has always been enough.